Good afternoon and welcome to the final instalment of Good afternoon and welcome to the final instalment of the current At Home with ERM and KJA webinar series. My name is Oliver Moore and I'm a partner at ERM. Over the past 5 weeks, ERM and KJA has presented on a set of topics that we hope has sparked thought, insight and learning to help support you and your organisation to continue to move forward, maintain delivery and innovate during the current global climate of COVID-19 restrictions. Following the success of the current series, we're looking to pull together a set of new topics for a second series of At Home with ERM and KJA. We will send through details of that once our presenters are confirmed. This fifth webinar, Environmental and Social Governance in the Time of COVID, is presented by Brett Mitch. Brett has over 30 years working in finance, working with clients globally. His experience working at organisations including Hastings Fund Management, Anglo America, China Light and Power, Lehman Brothers and Melbourne Water to provide him with the tools to deliver a coordinated approach to solving complex concerns encompassing social, environmental, technical, commercial and financial elements. Before we hand over to Brett, our facilitator for today, Raquel, will take us through how to use the GoToWebinar platform. Over to you, Raquel.
Thanks very much, Ollie. So everyone, welcome and welcome to the GoTo platform. We can advance to the next slide. I will describe to you the controls that you can now see. So on your control panel, you should be able to see a couple of these icons. Now, throughout the session, you'll be able to interact with us through those icons. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to make throughout the presentation, please feel free to do that by clicking on the question mark icon and then just typing your question in. If you have a question you'd like to ask at the end of the session when we open up for sort of a question and answer and discussion session on the topic, please raise your hand. And at that point in time, we'll be able to unmute you and you'll be alive to be able to speak with us. I will note that everyone is automatically muted on the session and please do note that the session is being recorded. Thank you, everyone, and over to you, Brett.
Thanks, Raquel, and good afternoon, everybody, and appreciate your time this afternoon. My name's Brett Mitch, as Ollie said, and I am a partner at ERM and responsible for our ESG advisory practice here in Australia and New Zealand. I'll go off camera and turn back to these slides. Okay, so firstly, what I'd like to do is start with an acknowledgement of country. We are in strange times, so I would like to extend an acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet today, and pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. In addition, I'd also like to specifically acknowledge the Yorta Yorta people and their lands in southern New South Wales, the lands that I grew up on. So let me first touch on what my objectives are for this webinar, namely to give you a bit of an insight into the what, the why, and the how of ESG. Specifically, what is it? Why is there increasing demand for ESG transparency and reporting, even in the time of COVID? And finally, how are we as ERM helping our clients take the concept of ESG and convert it into practical, operational, financial tools and metrics? Naturally, in the time we've got, we can only cover so much. So I would invite you to log any questions you have as we go, and we'll certainly try and answer them. If not in this session, then subsequent. Let me first start with those of you who are unfamiliar with ERM. ERM is the largest pure play environmental health and safety, risk and sustainability consulting firm in the world. We have been helping our clients for nearly 50 years deal with environmental problems from the mine site to the boardroom. And increasingly, those problems and those clients of ours are asking for assistance across a broader range of topics around sustainability and ESG more broadly. One of the big E's in ESG is climate change, and that's front and center for our assistance with our clients. But this assistance doesn't only include developing solutions to environmental problems, it's also helping our clients prepare and develop ESG strategies, to ensure that those strategies become goals and activities that can be monitored, reported on, and improved. Let's talk about the COVID curve. This is the ERM view of the COVID curve, and particularly it shows how we are seeing our clients think about flattening their own curve and moving through that curve and coming out the other side. Increasingly, clients are turning to us to help them consider what and how to recover and what a post-COVID world looks like and what challenges and opportunities will await them. We've unfortunately and tragically seen countries going through COVID at very different speeds and with very different intensities. And the implications for the global macroeconomic environment will play out over years, if not decades. Importantly, investors and boards and CEOs are starting to challenge their business models to enhance resilience and adaptability in the face of not only the macroeconomic factors, but also in the face of the ESG expectations of a number of stakeholders. There's no doubt in our mind that there will be winners and losers in the COVID exit, and it will be led by those companies who can not only envisage, but also articulate a future. Thinking about ESG assists in how to think through those future challenges and opportunities. So let's pause for a moment and unpack what ESG means. Broadly defined, ESG is a refined version of corporate social responsibility, and it encompasses the three elements of environmental, social, and governance factors. Each of these elements, as you can see on the screen, has a range of factors that are at a more granular level, and many of you will be familiar with a number of those factors that are on the screen there. Climate change is a big one in environment, and we've increasingly seen challenges because of COVID in people management and occupational health and safety, and inequalities and diversity. Let's be clear though, in the eyes of business, these can be turned into risks and opportunities. If you're a board member or in the C-suite, the language of risk is well known already. And so ESG can be thought of as a way of encapsulating the risks across each of those factors. Understanding what those risks are, determining what the impact of those risks are when it goes wrong, and how to mitigate those risks is an important part of the language of risk management. There's also a number of academic studies that have highlighted the correlation between ESG transparency and financial performance. And some of those studies would suggest that the differential between entities that have got very strong ESG strategies and those who have not can be upwards of 9% in terms of returns. And if you think about what 9% is, that's a significant alpha between not having an ESG strategy and having an ESG strategy. As you can appreciate, the flip side of the coin of risk is opportunity. And many of these factors that you see in front of you reflect opportunities as well. Opportunities to stand apart from your peers, opportunities to stand apart and ahead of your peers in front of your stakeholders and your customers. I've also put up here the Sustainable Development Goals. Many of you will be familiar with those goals and will have seen those logos and those items on a number of reports coming out of very large global corporates. And particularly in the face of COVID, what we're seeing is that Sustainable Development Goals, which have historically been seen through the lens of developing economies, are increasingly becoming a part of the first world economy as well. But let's pause there and talk about what and why ESG matters. ESG is no longer for hippies and greenies. If you're the chairman of one of the world's largest fund managers, Larry Fink, at BlackRock, with trillions of dollars invested in globally in many of the world's largest companies, you can see that Larry means business when it comes to environment. Consider Larry's comments. The evidence on climate risk is compelling investors to reassess core assumptions about modern finance. Larry has essentially stated that climate risk is a major financial challenge, and the access to capital that he controls and his friends globally control is going to be a function of how well you understand and report and monitor your ESG positioning. Consider your own superannuation fund. For those not in a self-managed super fund, ask yourself the question, or what your super fund is doing with your money. At the end of the day, in the absence of an ESG strategy and proof that those ESG risks that we mentioned on the prior page are being well managed by the companies that your super fund invests in, you don't know how long-term sustainable your super fund returns are. So we are seeing increasing focus by investors on ESG performance and monitoring, and that's reflected in accessing capital, and it's reflected in the expectations of returns from companies that have and have not got ESG strategies. COVID, in our mind, amplifies this paradigm. There are super funds who are going to look through COVID and continue to look at the long-term sustainability of those businesses they invest in on your behalf, and clarity on that ESG positioning is effectively a pathway to proof of management's ability to manage and plan for long-term sustainability. And in the absence of that, then there's an expectation that that long-term sustainability is not there. But there are other forces driving greater ESG transparency other than just accessing capital. If you look at the 4 quadrants on this page, we've touched upon the investor demand piece. We have increasingly seen regulatory pressures from regulators around increased transparency on ESG reporting. In the UK, for instance, the legislative onus on directors and company management to report how they're managing ESG risk is an increasingly significant legal compliance matter. Here in Australia, those of you who are familiar with the ESG debates that have gone on over the last several years will appreciate that APRA and ASIC have come out and made strong statements around ESG and monitoring and transparency. And in fact, we've been told very clearly that if you're a board member or a company director, if you're not thinking about ESG reporting, if you're not thinking about sustainability reporting, if you're not utilizing the frameworks that exist in the marketplace, then you're not probably doing your job from a fiduciary perspective. And that opens one up to challenges from a legal perspective. There's also increasing pressure from global reporting initiatives. You'll see there in the bottom left quadrant, PRI, United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing, is a fundamental framework for global investors. ERM is a PRI signatory, and we see the increased demand from our clients for assistance in helping them understand what PRI means, what investors who are signatories to PRI are looking for, how to meet the demands of those PRI signatories. Once again, check your super fund, see if they're a PRI signatory. Most of those large super funds, most of the Australian large super funds are PRI signatories, and they're increasingly looking to ensure that the investments that they make on your behalf as beneficiaries are meeting those principles of responsible investing expectations. Last but not least, there's also increasing action by peers. And the importance of this is tied to accessing capital and engagement with stakeholders. How you stack up against your peers is an increasingly important measure of how you manage your business. So it's not just the external marketplace, it's also your peers, your competitors who are putting out their own sustainability reporting, and you need to know where you stand because it is important that you understand what the competitive pressures are coming at you from the marketplace. So let's pause and get a view on your thoughts. But before we do, let's just touch on the 5 inconveniences that you see here on this page. Before COVID, all 5 of these global themes were driving pressure on companies and leaders. And as an example, as those of you with teenagers will know, the social media accelerant around opinions is only increasing. Gen Z kids today are going to be both voters and consumers over the next 10 years, what we think of as a decade for action. Similarly, cybersecurity and impacts on critical infrastructure in an almost entirely digital world go to the heart of quality of life in society. Ecosystem damage is rarely out of the press, but COVID has pushed it off page one. But it doesn't mean that it's solved. And finally, we're seeing new leadership emerging as non-typical players stake their claim to the high ground. One only has to see the interesting issues in the US, where states have banded together to ignore the president around COVID responses to illustrate this point. Loose federations are going to increasingly become more powerful advocates for long-term climate change response. And we're also seeing that with large corporations globally. Many of our large global clients are looking to not wait for policy debate and regulatory outcomes. They're looking to drive those changes themselves because they see the imperative, as I said, from investors, they see the imperative from stakeholders and consumers. And so politics is not necessarily going to be leading the way. We did want to check and test with you all as part of a poll where you're seeing each of these in the context of your own organisations. So we're going to run an online survey. And I'm going to ask Raquel to assist, but I'd like you to think of which of these challenges is the most front and centre for your organisation post-COVID.
Thanks, Brett. So look, everyone, what you should be able to see on your screen now is our quick poll. The question posed, as Brett has explained, is which of these is the greatest external challenge for your organisation? So what we see are the options that you can select from: climate change, citizen power, cybersecurity threats, saving ecosystems, and new leadership. Now, I can see your answers coming in. I'll just give it another few seconds for people to give it some thought and cast their vote. Oh, this is great. I can see the front runner is changing back and forth, but it looks like we've settled on our voting now. Excellent. So I'm going to close that now, and I'll be able to share on the screen the results. So what we see here is that for you in the audience, we have 42% who've indicated climate change, 33% for citizen power, 17% for cybersecurity threats, and 8% for new leadership. Brett.
Thanks, Raquel. And I think it's a really watching that play out and through as you all voted is interesting in and of itself, right? I think that climate change has never really dropped off the radar, and I think most smart money is seeing COVID, particularly now and here in Australia, where we're seeing a significant flattening of the curve. That those things that were compelling in November, December are still compelling as we sit here in May, June, and it's a really important reflection that from an ESG perspective, as I said at the start, climate change is the big E of ESG, and there are so many significant elements to it. And I think the other interesting point is that citizen power as the second aspect to this really reflects that we have moved to a situation in society where not only the younger people, but the rise of social media and the ability for social media to lead debate, as it were, is increasingly an important part of an organisation's awareness of what's happening in the marketplace. And so, a big component of ESG is understanding who your stakeholders are, and we'll touch upon that in the next slide. But that's a really important and interesting set of feedback. So thank you. Let's talk about what do we do and how do we help our clients? And I think the important part of ESG is a recognition that there is a journey involved. If you talk to investors, if you talk to stakeholders more broadly, there is an appreciation that this is a wicked problem. Climate change is a wicked issue because of the complexity of the players, the complexity of the interactions between the inputs and the outputs. as well as the role that various stakeholders play in the process. So let's talk about what that sort of journey looks like, if you will, and this is where it probably gets to some of the more of the nuts and bolts stuff. So in our view, there are 4 stages to maturity of an organization on that ESG journey. At the very left-hand side, there is, of course, a compliance focus. Compliance with law is clearly an obvious requirement, but it's a question of why go beyond what needs to be done? Why go beyond the law? And that's really there's an aha moment where there's a number of these external forces coalesce into a signal that becomes overwhelming, that it's no longer about just compliance with the law. Compliance with the law, really, at that level, it's almost a question of what you'll hear is sort of internally people will say, well, why bother? What is the relevance of ESG? And it's really a box checking exercise. It's the sort of experience you might have if you turn up to an ESG conference and feel somewhat clueless as to what people are talking about and why. As people become more familiar with and thoughtful about those external forces that play, organizations we find move through to the value protection phase, where people start to think about how do you protect what you've got, and what does a focus on ESG help you do, and moving it from ad hoc to somewhat thoughtful processes around risks, thoughtful processes around what initiatives you might put in place, and some degree of limited annual reporting associated with ESG. As typically at that point, it feels a little hard to have an engagement with stakeholders and be able to explain what ESG means, but you've kind of got a sense of what at least the initials stand for. As an organization moves to the third stage of awareness, we see that policies and protocols become more familiar and put in place, and in part it becomes as much a question of what does ESG not mean. Clearly materiality is an important factor in this process. There are some things that are more material than others, and a recognition of materiality tends to, at this point in the cycle of evolving, becomes a more definitive statement, and certainly drives more thoughtful framing of what ESG is. It's probably at this point where people start to know certainly what ESG means. You can probably explain ESG to your stakeholders, and my acid test is that you can go home and explain to your teenage son or teenage daughter what ESG means. If you wax lyrical about sustainable development goals, all of a sudden they see you as helping to save the world. But you're not quite there yet. In the fourth part of the journey, ESG becomes a clear driver of corporate strategy. It's a recognition of not only just the risks, but also the opportunities that occur from ESG, whether it's because of the opportunities vis-a-vis your peers, your competitors, but also the opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to increase productivity, increase operational performance, and ultimately it starts to get to a point where it's embedded within business unit processes, it's embedded within your reporting, and it's embedded within your engagement with your broader stakeholder universe. At that point, you're probably doing these presentations yourself. You've become a champion of ESG, and you could recognize the longer term benefits and risks associated with it. However, from our viewpoint, there is clearly a normal distribution across these 4 slices. It is rare to find those on the right-hand side. It's rare to find those on the left-hand side. There are a large number of people in column B and column C, and it is, as I say, a journey. So when you talk to and think about and engage with your stakeholders, it's that ability to tell the story of your journey. And where are you going and how are you getting there? So Let me just turn, this is the last slide. Oh, sorry, we were going to do one more Mentimeter on this one. Raquel, can I ask you to articulate the question for this, please?
Sure can. So look, just quickly with this quick poll, in regards to what Brett has just taken us through, where do you believe your organisation sits on that maturity model? So Brett's just described for us those points of A, B, C and D. So A being compliance and legacy issues, B being value protection, C being value enhancement, and D being sustainable value creation. So take a moment, have a think, and select which one you think is best representing where your organisation is at this point in time on that matrix. Okay, I can see everyone's popping their vote in. It's changing slightly as we go, but I'm going to give it probably another 10 seconds just to give you a chance to think about it and click on the one that best represents your organisation. Great. All right, I'm going to show the results so we can all take a look. There we are. So we have compliance and legacy issues and value protection coming in even at 27%. And then we have 36% sitting in that value enhancement phase, with 9% coming in at the sustainable value creation. Brett?
Thanks, Raquel. And I find this fascinating. I think the 27% in bucket A are honest. And I think the B and C probably reflects the norm. It's 57, 63%. 2/3 or thereabouts in the middle two buckets is not surprising. I think there is an appreciation, and watching people as you're putting in the votes, I think this is a group that is either self-selected to come to this webinar because they wanted to know more from point A. Hopefully we've given the 9% in column D something to think about as well. But as I say, this is a journey. Those of you who have had to tell the story of what ESG means to your organisation will appreciate that it is a journey, and I think stakeholders appreciate that and expect that nothing happens overnight, but it's getting on and being on the journey that's just as important. So thank you for your responses on those. One last slide. Really what we tried to do here is to give you some thoughts on what you can do starting tomorrow. This list is not meant to be exclusive, and it's certainly not a complete list. And if you start with a view that doing nothing is not an option, as we would espouse, then a lot of the early steps that you can see here probably, hopefully, feel pretty obvious. You can read them, but let me pick out 3 just to highlight some points. Point number 1, what are your competitors doing? If they're reporting on ESG, you'll find it on their website. We help a lot of our clients by developing and applying benchmarking across their peer group, looking at gaps and thinking about and working with them to close those gaps, both at an operational level and a reporting level. One could argue that sounds blindingly obvious. And it is blindingly obvious to once you've heard it and you go, of course that's something we could do, because as I say, the transparency is just as important as the content. So you will find, if somebody has a sustainability report, you will find it on their website. The second point I'd like to highlight is know who your stakeholders are and what do they want. Those of you, for instance, who engage with government will know that government is a key stakeholder in decisions that affect businesses across many facets and factors within the organisation. How do you engage with government? What are they looking for? How do you engage with communities in which you operate? A number of my colleagues on this call spend a tremendous amount of time supporting our clients in engagement with local communities and incorporating that feedback into action plans to mitigate risk and enhance opportunities to deal with that community. So knowing who your stakeholders are assists in knowing what their issues are, which assists in knowing what the risks to you as a business are. Once again, blindingly obvious. The third, and this is also one that I love telling because it sort of resonates, is tell your story. right? For those of you who've got technical organizations who spend a lot of time thinking about the technical risks and opportunities associated with your business, remember that your stakeholders aren't necessarily technically minded. It doesn't mean that they're not interested in what you're doing, but tell your story better, because people want to hear stories about what you're doing to assist in an ESG way, enhance your business, reduce the risks associated with your business, and enhance the opportunities that are coming to you because of your understanding of those risks. So we've got to the end of the presentation, and as I said at the start, there's only so much you can cover in ESG in the space of 30 minutes. And so this was really about giving you a sense of not only what ESG meant, giving you a sense of what the reason for taking it seriously is, what are those external forces that are acting on you as an organization, and how we see how we help our clients at a very practical level, both enhancing and assisting them with writing and developing their ESG strategy, but also operationalizing that, taking it into the organization so you're actually doing something with it. That's the important part. So you can now go home. You can impress your families or friends with, much to my 18-year-old daughter's horror, how woke you are to ESG. Thank you very much.
Brett, you didn't just say woke. That's wonderful. Thanks, Brett. All right, everyone. So look, now it's an opportunity. If you have any questions for Brett or any comments or discussion points you'd like to raise in the context of what we've just seen and shared, please raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon on your control panel, or alternately, type a question into the question mark icon if you'd like to type that and write that through to us. Okay, we have our first question. So this will be Daryl. Daryl, I'm just going to unmute your line for you. It's clear now. If you could go ahead, Daryl.
Okay, thank you, Raquel, and a fantastic presentation, Brett. As you would know, because we're colleagues, but I do love ESG, and I, from my travels pre-COVID, I did pick up in Europe and North America the enthusiasm and the amount of organisations who have looked at ESG to be a you know, not only an essential part of their DNA, but also as a marketing strategy. Is there any reason why it seems to me that Australia has hasn't picked up the ESG banner as much as North America or Europe? It's a two-pronged question. First is why do you think, and is ESG a marketing strategy that I think would be you know, for internal and external stakeholders a brilliant opportunity for companies to sell the benefits of what they do?
Yeah, thanks, Daryl, and appreciate the question. On the why front, I think there is a degree of stratification in both communities as well as various stakeholders. There are people who see ESG as an operational risk tool and think of it as, well, why is that any different to what I'm doing now? And I think that's the point I was trying to make with the tell the story bit, because ESG is a framework for thinking about the risks under each of those buckets. The Australian market is we're not good at sort of shouting from the rooftops our story. I think there are a large number of Australian organisations who do good ESG, for want of a better phrase, but they don't actually know what they're doing, and they don't tell the story about what they're doing through the lens of ESG. However, having said that, as I said, the majority of the large Australian superannuation funds are PRI signatories. The majority of those Australian super funds are very active in engaging with investments around ESG. Sometimes when you read about what they're doing, you won't necessarily twig to the fact it's ESG. It may be characterized as stakeholder activism, it may be characterized as social responsibility. All of those things, though, are ESG. So I think, yeah, certainly in the Australian market, ESG is there, it's prevalent, and it just may not be known as that. On your second point about marketing strategy, I think it's a really interesting one, that ESG risks have ESG opportunities. And as I said at the start, that list of things is around making sure you understand what the risks are to your organization, being able to articulate what those risks are, and also being able to articulate what you can do about those risks to mitigate them, as well as find the opportunities. And so marketing in its purest sense around understanding what your clients want, whether you're selling financial services, whether you're selling professional services, whether you're selling keyline at a dockside, whether you're selling medical services, most people want to know that you know how to manage your risks. You know how to build a sustainable business, and that you can contribute to and continue to contribute to society. So I think marketing is one of those words that has a whole range of color and shade to it. But at the end of the day, ESG is really around, do you understand your risks, and do you understand the opportunities, and do you know how to do something about them to mitigate the risks and take account of the opportunities?
Thanks, Brett. Now we've got our next hand up, so I'm going to go to Matt now. Matt, I'll just unmute your line. It's clear, if you could go ahead.
Hi, Brett. Matt Klein speaking. I've noticed in previous surveys of stakeholders broadly in times of financial crises, so GFC, 97, Southeast Asia crisis, etc., environmental and social aspects kind of go down the list of hierarchy of people's importance. And I just wonder, what do you think makes this one different around COVID? And do you think environmental and social aspects will continue to be high on people's agenda as they were pre-COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think the fundamental difference between previous financial crises and now is that the pre-COVID response in the world is that, as I said, it's been moved out of the political sphere. It's been moved out of the large office buildings, almost into the hearts and minds of the people. And I think what we're seeing is climate change and the urgency associated with climate change. One only has to go back to our own experiences here in Australia in September through March to think about climate change and the implications of physical risks from climate change and disasters. It has changed the mindset of folks that even though we're sitting in a bit of a bubble, sitting at home, working from our homes, the fundamentals of what's happening in the real world have tipped over the edge, so that ESG, as it's reflected in climate change and reflected in all of the things that come with climate change, has, I think, become a bellwether that will still resonate post-COVID. And that's what we're seeing from our clients. Our clients are coming to us and saying, we're looking beyond COVID. We're looking for how do we take into account sustainability. And if we are in the worst macroeconomic conditions for over 150 years, then sustainability of our business becomes even more paramount. So what does sustainability mean? It means knowing who our clients are. It means knowing who our stakeholders are. It means knowing what our operations are and what the implications and impacts of our operations are. So what we're finding is that COVID has almost crystallized around, how is my business sustainable? How will I continue to get clients to generate revenue, to reduce costs, to make sure my equity capital is happy, my debt capital is repaid, and the society that I live in is the best it can be because of my involvement in that society. So I think the other times as counterpoints were A, not as severe, B, people didn't really believe in climate change the same way they believe in climate change now. The third part, as I mentioned earlier, is that Gen X and millennials who didn't have, well, when we were that age, we didn't have the access to social media. We didn't have the ability to create and generate and distribute and broadcast our opinions the same way. And so we're also seeing a global response from a group of people who are far more switched on than we were at that age in those crises.
Thanks for that, Brett. Now we do have time for one final question. So I'm going to move to David. David, I'm just unmuting your line now. If you could go ahead.
Hi, Brett. Look, I'm intrigued. I've got a few sort of comments and questions. I mean, looking at ESG as a risk management tool, I mean, an interesting question is whether COVID-19 is an ESG risk. And I kind of think it is, but, you know, people can argue over that all day. But does that mean that going forward, given that we've had this shock to businesses, and my guess is many businesses did not have a management plan in place for a global pandemic, that ESG will cause them to look at a much wider range of black swan type issues that could come at their business, and that ESG will be one of the lenses to look out there and say, what are the things we never expected to hit our business, which could hit our business and which we need to be prepared for?
Yeah, look, it's a really good point, David. I mean, I think I agree with you. I don't think anybody had the idea that a black swan event would be a global pandemic as it has been. And it's not just the global pandemic. It is a global pandemic at a time when there are significant geopolitical pressures between great powers. And so the implications for the economy are overwhelming. I think where this is going to take people is that they are going to recognize and appreciate, those of you who are switched on to scenarios and thinking about probabilistic distribution functions and time series, what it's going to do is it's going to take long-term projections and scenario models, and it's going to start making people think about what are those adjacent issues that come with these scenarios. As many of you will appreciate, those of you who switched on to ESG, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure framework, TCFD framework, fundamentally looks to scenarios to drive an awareness and an understanding of financial risks from climate change. But it's not just climate change, right? It's the things that happen because of the climate change. It is those cross-correlation of things. So if you have, for instance, an increase in temperature and you're a mining company and you think about the access and exposure to your workforce, and you can't have the same number of shifts because it's too hot, and so you've got to have more shifts, it increases your air conditioning costs. The depreciation life of your assets is lower because they're running at hotter temperatures. All of those things become outputs and inputs into a much more sophisticated way of thinking about risk. Black swan events, by definition, are undefinable. But I think what's going to happen is people are going to start taking a much broader view on how these risks will crystallize, and that can only be a good thing, right? When you start thinking about all of these things and how they interact, what's the thing that's going to stop them, or what's the thing that's going to drive them to financial and operational risks to businesses? So I think, you know, the one thing that we're seeing for those of you on the call, we at ERM are spending a lot more time helping our clients consider what those scenarios are, consider how to engage with a broader subject matter expert group of people to feed into the what if type scenarios. If this happens, then what will that do? If that happens, then what will happen next? And so black swan events, even though they're by definition impossible to define, will become what we'll see as a much greater range of what could be seen historically as implausible outcomes, but are now seen as possible outcomes. The last thing I would say on that is there is a very real focus on, those of you who appreciate annual exceedance probabilities will know that there's a very real focus on 1 in 100 is no longer 1 in 100. Stationarity is dead. That's not my phrase. That when you think about the implications of a 1 in 500 event becoming a 1 in 100 event, then that changes a whole raft of things, whether you're an insurance company, whether you're a mining company, a power company, a property company. Those things will have a massive impact on even just thinking about what scenarios are. So David, it's a favourite topic of mine, as I'm sure you've picked up, and one that we could talk for hours, but I know we're out of time. So thank you for the question.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Brett. And thank you, everyone. That does bring us to the conclusion of today's session. I will just draw your attention to the ongoing topics of the series. Brett, if you could advance us to the next slide, you'll be able to see that we've got a number of topics that we'll be covering through the June-July period. So we'll be looking at crisis communications, digital services, safety leadership, and mining. What is the mine that we would want to see? So a number of topics there. We will be sending information out in the coming week about those sessions, and invite you to register to attend and share those with your colleagues as well. So thank you all very much for your attendance and participation today. We really appreciate your time. We hope you've enjoyed this series so far, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.